Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be covering the book of Nehemiah. Now, if you don't know what the book is about, it's basically the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem and the reforms of the community. But before we cover the book of Nehemiah, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe because these videos actually take a really long time to make and you'd be doing me the biggest favor if you actually did do those things. But without further ado, let's cover the book of Nehemiah. So one day, Nehemiah's brother pulled up to the place he was at and basically told him that the walls of Jerusalem were fallen and the gate was badly burned. This greatly upset Nehemiah, leading him into mourning. This led Nehemiah into a deep sorrow. He cried for days, and he thought it was very terrible of what was happening to his people. It actually made him so worried to the point where he couldn't eat or sleep for days on end. But Nehemiah didn't only be sad. He actually prayed to God. And in this prayer of his, or when he was praying to God, he asked God to please forgive the Israelites for the mistakes they had done. And in the final prayer of this chapter, Nehemiah asked God to just help him do something about it. And he also asked God to help him gain favor of the king, so he was allowed to go back to Jerusalem and help rebuild. Nehemiah ends his prayer by asking God for guidance in his steps, and he also really needed God's help because, he needed the king in order for him to go back home. Basically, God just needed to open the doors for Nehemiah. And then one day while Nehemiah was serving the king noticed that Nehemiah was upset. And, this was a big deal because Nehemiah had never been sad in front of the king. And, the king asked Nehemiah, what's wrong? Why are you sad? Nehemiah was scared, but he also wanted to ask God for help. So in the time span of which the king asked Nehemiah if he was okay, Nehemiah did a quick prayer to God asking him for help. And then he told the king that he was upset because of what was happening in Jerusalem. Nehemiah asks the king, if it pleases you, can I go back to Jerusalem to help rebuild my city walls? And he also asked the king for letters for safe travel and to also get wood to help rebuild his city walls. The king was surprised, but the king was like, okay, you can, but how long are you going to be gone? And then Nehemiah gave him a time frame. And Nehemiah was free to go do this, and he knew it was only happening because of God. Nehemiah gets letters to travel safely, and not only did he get letters to help him travel safely, he also had letters to help him get through certain areas of, places, and he also got letters to help him get the wood to rebuild his city. As soon as Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem, he sees how bad it actually is and how much damage was done to Jerusalem. So he's just looking around, and he's just like... The next day, Nehemiah had to speak with the leaders of Jerusalem, and he basically told them, hey, the Jerusalem is in a terrible state, we need to fix it. Nehemiah also shares how God helped him get the permission of the king to help him come back to help rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and the people start getting excited and they wanted to help too. But not everybody was happy that Nehemiah was there. Two guys, Sanballat and Tobiah, were actually very unhappy that Nehemiah was in Jerusalem. They basically went on to mock Nehemiah, saying that, this project of yours is gonna fail. And Nehemiah, he didn't really listen to them. He knew God was gonna help him out on this. And then Nehemiah starts calling on the people of Jerusalem to help him build the walls back up to what it originally was. Which, awesome. Different groups of people worked on different parts of the wall. Basically, they all had specific jobs on what they were going to do, which, oh, shoot. And a lot of people actually got involved. Everybody from priests to regular people. Everybody came together to help Nehemiah rebuild the walls to what it formerly was. The priests were actually the first to start working, and they actually worked on the part of the wall that was called the sheep gate. Which, sheep gate. I don't know what a sheep gate is, but that's just what it says. They actually dedicated that section of the wall to God, and they made it really holy along the way. This was basically in the honor of God. The men from Jericho and a family named Sekur actually helped out too. And they also worked on sections too. Each group worked side by side to fix the broken pieces. And it showed how good it was, how people could come together, and how they could actually make this happen. Another group of workers were the sons of Hanasai, and they actually worked on the section of the wall that was near the fish gates. And the wall was starting to look better and better. Yes. And not only that, the goldsmiths and the merchants, if you guys don't know what those types of jobs are, they were basically, they made metals and stuff, and they also jumped in too to help them with the building. And this showed that everybody was jumping in to help rebuild Jerusalem, or rebuild the Jerusalem walls. And then the nobles of Tekoa were actually supposed to help them work, or were supposed to pitch in. They were supposed to help, but they were too proud, and instead of helping them, they just oversaw the work and just like, yeah, we're not working, even though this is for God. No, we don't want to help you. And then the daughters of Shalom actually started helping them too. This showed that women, men, young, old, it didn't matter. That everybody was helping in, and everybody was pitching in to help, rebuild the Jerusalem walls. And they also worked somewhere near the water gate. Nehemiah wasn't only there to give orders and stuff. He actually oversaw the work. So he would stay with them and he would guide them on what to do, and he would basically just stay with them, and when times got tough, he was there. And then Sanballat, one of the enemies of Jerusalem, actually saw them working on it, and he got upset, and he was like, no, you guys can't build it. He was upset because if they actually did successfully build the Jerusalem walls back up again, they'd be at their former strength of what they previously were, him being an enemy of Jerusalem. Not good. So he started mocking them, and he was like, oh, you guys actually think you're gonna build this all by yourselves? Which, yes, because it was a ton of people helping build the Jerusalem walls back to what it formerly was, but yeah, Sanballat continues to ridicule the people, saying stuff like, hey man, a fox could knock this down. A fox could knock these walls down. His insults were to discourage the people and also make them think that their work was pointless. And Nehemiah, who is present in all of this, instead of responding to them or something like that, he actually decided to pray to God. He goes on to ask God, Lord, we're trying to rebuild the walls and we can't do it with them yapping over there, and we're hoping that you will deal with them. He basically asked God to listen to their mocking and to deal with them. And even though Sanballat is just straight up mocking them and just being mean to them, they kept on working, and Nehemiah was there to make sure that they focused on the walls and, also didn't get distracted by the insults. And when the people were not giving up, the enemies, or, Sanballat, sees them, and he gets a big group of people together, and he gets ready to attack them because they're not stopping. Nehemiah gets word of this, and instead of getting all panicky, oh my goodness, bro, you gotta listen to this, dude. Instead of Nehemiah actually getting panicky or scared by this dude literally tells them, he's like, yo, get ready for battle. He's like, yo, oh my goodness. He basically tells them yo, half of you need to strap up, make sure you're ready for when they come back, and half of you need to keep on working with this. That was the aura dripping from this dude. He's like, we still gonna build the wall, even if y'all do pull up, we gonna smoke y'all. Yo, that's so cool. Nehemiah also asked God for help, and he encouraged his workers, basically saying, don't worry, we have God on our side, we can do this. Despite the threats, the workers kept on working, and Nehemiah told them to be ready for when they actually do come back. So yeah, bro was prepared. And then the people start complaining about their poverty, basically saying that they dropped everything to come help rebuild the Jerusalem walls. Also, that they were borrowing money from other people just to pay for taxes and food and stuff like that. And then the rich people basically take advantage of the poor people, and they made them pay at high interest and stuff like that. This made Nehemiah very upset. Ooh. Nehemiah thought it wasn't right that the rich people were treating their own people badly while they were workers and the people were coming together to help build the Jerusalem walls. This greatly upset Nehemiah. And then he called together the rich people and, and he basically told them that it wasn't right that they were doing this while they were building Jerusalem, and that they were in this together and that they needed to stop. Basically telling them that we should be helping out each other instead of taking advantage of one another. And then Nehemiah speaks about the right way to help. He also goes on to say about he had been treating the workers fairly, he had been giving them back land, money, he hadn't been charging them interest, and basically he was told them that, this is how things should be done by with kindness and by with fairness. And then the rich people agreed to stop. They agreed to, like, stop, charging them so much. And basically just stop taking advantage of them because, what they were doing was very bad. And then Nehemiah basically set an example, basically saying that, I'm the governor of this thing. Like, I could easily just take away their land, their money, stuff like that. But I just choose not to. And I don't, take advantage of them. The people had promised to do right and to return what was taken from others. And then they made a covenant to act fairly. And then Nehemiah basically made them promise before God that they were going to, act fairly and with kindness and with fairness. With kindness and with respect. And the enemies basically start plotting against Nehemiah, and they knew that the wall in Jerusalem were almost being being rebuilt. So they were like, oh man, we got to do something about this. And then they sent an invitation to Nehemiah, but Nehemiah knew it was a trick, so he just didn't go, which, I feel like is the smart thing you should do. But yeah, Nehemiah basically refuses the meeting, and he says, hey, I'm doing a great job here. Why would I stop this work just to come meet with you guys? And then Sanballat, the enemy, sends him 4 more messages being like, hey, come on, pull up. And Nehemiah keeps like, no, I'm not going to. I'm good. And then they started hitting him with false accusations to Nehemiah. They basically accused Nehemiah of wanting to become the new king. And the reason why he was rebuilding the walls is so he could overthrow the king of Persia. This was a very terrible accusation because this could get Nehemiah into a bunch of trouble. And then, Nehemiah prays, and then he denies the accusations. He goes on to say, like, you guys are just trying to scare me. I didn't do any of this. He didn't, so yeah. And then the wall was finished, and then the enemies were like, oh man, this isn't good, because they knew that God was the only type of thing that could help them out in building this in such a short amount of time. Basically, the wall was built in like 52 days, so that to build an entire wall of Jerusalem within the time span of 52 days is a short amount of time. Like, they got that done quick. And not after that, Nehemiah didn't stop. Like, he was fully committed to Jerusalem. So he also knew that the enemies were going to try something later, but, he just prays to God and, goes on with his days. More specifically, he prayed for protection and strength. Now that the wall was completed, Nehemiah then goes on to make sure that the city is protected and well guarded and well secure. He puts guards on each side of, like, where they're supposed to be, and yeah, he just makes sure that it's secure and protected. And then Nehemiah appointed leaders in Jerusalem. One of them, or the one that was in charge of Jerusalem, was his brother Hanani. He also input someone named and then he appoints Hananiah. The guy just said I just struggled with his name a bunch. So he appoints Hananiah to be the leader/person in charge of Citadel. It was a strong part of the city. These men were trustworthy and they feared God, making them good leaders. And then Nehemiah has a command to protect the city. He basically says that don't open the gates unless the sun is hot. This made it to where no one was able to sneak in, and yeah, stuff like that. And then he basically counts the people of Jerusalem. Some of them were people that were exiled from Jerusalem and had returned to Jerusalem from exile. These people came back to rebuild their city and their community. The list also included the families of those who had returned. And then Nehemiah basically does a genealogy of, like, the people, so it's just a big, long list of names. And then the people basically gave offerings to Jerusalem, so this was basically just to help Jerusalem, basically just to support Jerusalem, so, yeah, good on them. And the city needed more people. Nehemiah came to the realization that Jerusalem wasn't well populated enough, so he decided that surrounding areas around Jerusalem should come and live in Jerusalem. He needed to make sure that the city had enough people to protect it and to take care of the temple and the work that still needed to be done. And then the people gathered together to hear the law, which is spoken by Ezra. We covered him in the last video, but Ezra basically gets up and he, starts reading the law. And, this just covers that the people wanted to hear the law. Yeah. They wanted to hear God's word and how to live according to it. And then Ezra reads the law to the people. And he didn't just, speed through it. He, actually told them and, was like, Okay, actually read it to them is what I'm trying to say. He read from the early morning until noon. The people responded with reverence, and what this means is that as Ezra was basically telling them the word, they kept saying stuff like amen, amen, and they got face down on the ground and then they started worshiping God. The Levites would help the people understand the law, so basically they would go up to them and, try to get them to understand the law and how to apply it to their lives, which is, dope, yes. And if you guys don't know who the Levites are, they were priests and helpers. And then the more they heard the law, the more they got sad because they realized that, as the more they learned, the more that they had realized that they had fallen away from, God's ways, and they were sad because of this. But Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Levites told them that this was a day to be celebrated because they were about to get back on the way of God. They were about to start following him again. And then the people celebrate the Feast of the Tabernacle. If you guys don't know what that is, it's basically a time of joy where they would celebrate how God brought them out of the city of Egypt and, stuff like that. This was a time of joy where they would live in temporary shelters to celebrate how God brought them out of the city of Egypt. Basically just a celebration of, God. Cool. And also how God had guided them through the journey in the wilderness. Yeah. And basically, as Ezra had told them, they went home, got food, and started celebrating the Feast of the Tabernacle. So yeah, it was just a really good time, and they were like, yeah, this is great. And then after they were done celebrating the Feast of the Tabernacle, they fasted and they prayed. If you guys don't know what fasted means, it means they didn't eat food and they prayed. So during this time, they would wear something called a sackcloth. It was a sign of sorrow, showing how serious they were about returning back to God. And then the people started listening to the law, as previously. They listened to it and realized that they had not been following God's ways, so they were listening to it so they could apply the law, to their lives, so they could, follow it, because, self-explanatory. It's called the law for a reason. This made them deeply sorry for their mistakes, or sorry, whatever, and they just wanted to make things right, which, yeah, good on them. Turn back to God. Let's go. And then the people praised God for his faithfulness. The Levites led them into prayer, and they basically prayed about stuff like, and thanking him for his faithfulness, like how he brought them out of the land in Egypt, and stuff like that. And then the people confessed their failures, like they would talk about stuff, how their ancestors would, worship false idols, and how they would turn away from God, and they just admitted their failures. So yeah. And then the people admit God's justice, and they came to the realization that any type of punishment that befell them was from the, results of their own sin. And yeah. They also recognized that God had always been merciful to them, and also had never completely abandoned them. And then the people commit to obeying God. They came to the realization that, we're gonna vow to follow God, and we're just gonna follow him, and we're gonna turn away from all that, and we're gonna put him first instead. They vowed to follow his commands and to follow his word, and also to live according to his word. And then the people sign a covenant. This was basically just to basically just to obey God and to follow his laws and stuff like that. And then the leaders sign a covenant. So yeah, they were also very committed on following God. They wrote their names down, because they were serious about following God, and so on and so forth. And then the people joined in on the covenant. The people who understood it agreed to it. So they signed it too, and they basically wanted, to commit themselves to following God, his commandments, and his laws. The people made specific promises in the covenant, promising to not intermarry with foreigners, keep the Sabbath day holy, give the tenth, to provide for the temple. They vowed not to marry people from other nations because it would lead them into idolatry and away from God. They promised to keep the Sabbath day holy, just as God has told them to. And the people promised to give a tenth of their income to the temple. They also promised to provide for the temple. And this was the people's final commitment. They committed themselves to following God. They wanted to follow God and just commit themselves to his law and, him in general. So, yeah. They agreed to ensure that the temple would function as the place where they would worship and offer God sacrifices. And then the leaders and the people moved to Jerusalem. So Nehemiah came to the conclusion that, Jerusalem isn't well populated, so he encouraged some people to move there. And then Nehemiah called on people who would volunteer to go live in Jerusalem. They wanted people to move to Jerusalem because Jerusalem was like the city of worship, and it was home to the temple, a place where they would worship and offer God sacrifices. Yeah, stuff like that. He didn't force anyone, but he asked for people to willingly volunteer to like leave their home and go live in Jerusalem. And then Nehemiah makes a really big list of families that moved to Jerusalem. Yeah, I hope you're enjoying the video so far. Hey, while you're at it, you can like, comment, and subscribe. That you'd be doing me a really big favor. You don't have to, but you'd be doing me a great favor if you did. Thank you. It's also important to mention that the leaders and the priests were mentioned first because, these are very important people. Important people. By populating the city of Jerusalem, Nehemiah was making sure that the city was properly taken care of, and that, the people could be close to the temple and they could be close to, worshiping God and stuff like that, yeah. And then Nehemiah focused on the Levites and the priests, and he basically keeps a long list of, like, the people of, the Levites and the priests, yeah. And then after the people settled in Jerusalem, they had a special event called the Dedication of Wall. It was basically where they would thank God for helping them rebuild the Jerusalem walls. It was called the Dedication of the Wall. And the priests and the Levites had a special role in the dedication ceremony. They purified themselves and the people to make the occasion holy. They led people into prayer and worship, thanking God for his holiness. And then Nehemiah arranges two great choirs. This was basically for them to march around the walls. One group went left and the other went right. They were basically praising God for his work in rebuilding the city. And then the people start rejoicing and they offer sacrifices, which, was pretty good. Yeah. Good times. Yeah. During this time, the people also renewed their support to the temple. They promised to bring their tithes and offerings and first fruits to provide for the priests and the Levites so that they could continue to serve God. This was important because it ensured that the worship of God would be the central life of the community. Nehemiah continues his efforts to ensure that the people still live in obedience to God. He begins reading from the book of law to the people. He learns that the people were not following God's instructions fully. So he sets out to correct the situation. Nehemiah comes to the realization, and he becomes shocked when he finds out some of the men of Israel had married foreign wives, which was against God's law. These marriages were leading Israelites to worship false gods. Nehemiah becomes angry and confronts the people, telling them that they are making the same mistake that their ancestors did, which led to their downfall. He rebukes them for their disobedience and forces them to separate from their foreign wives. And then Nehemiah purges the temple because he comes to the realization that Eliashib, that's his name, that's the priest's name, that Eliashib was letting an enemy use the temple as a storage room. This was terrible because the temple is supposed to be holy. Nehemiah then becomes furious and throws out the supplies that was stored in there by the enemy. And then Nehemiah comes to the realization that the priests and the Levites are not being properly supported because the people stopped paying their tithes. As a result, the workers had to go work in the fields, and they had to stop working in the temple. Nehemiah then calls the people back to their responsibility and commands that the people start paying their tithes and they be brought to the storerooms so that the Levites could continue their work in the temple, or so they could return to their duties. And then Nehemiah also finds out that people are working on Sabbath, which is a clear violation of God's law. He also came to find out that people were coming in to Jerusalem through the gates so that they could sell goods. When he heard about this, he rebuked them and told them to shut the gates down. Nehemiah also deals with more marriages. He also comes to the realization that the children don't speak Hebrew, and instead they're, speaking languages of surrounding nations. And then Nehemiah realizes that, the children are not being taught on God's law. And then, And then Nehemiah calls for action that the Israelites keep their identities and follow God's commands. And then in one final prayer, Nehemiah basically asks God to remember all the good he has done and to forgive the people on their disobedience. He is frustrated by the repeated failures of the people, but hopes God will bless his efforts to restore righteousness in Jerusalem. And yeah, that was the book of Nehemiah. I just want to go ahead and say, if I have been saying a repetitive amount of us, I don't mean to. That's just, the way I speak. I don't mean to do that. I also want to go ahead and say, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, because these videos actually take a really long time to make, and you'd be doing me the biggest favor if you actually did do those things. And yeah, I also want to go ahead and say, if I know some people complain that the videos are not longer. This book of the Bible was 13 chapters. It wasn't long. But, yeah, just thank you guys. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, especially subscribe, because we are on the verge of hitting 100,000 subscribers. Currently, at this recording, we're about at 61K. But, yeah, I feel like that's about it. I thank you, I love you, and God bless.